All right. Well, we're going to take a minute, and usually I do these on the water, but we're going to take a minute just to review the jig rod that you've seen me using a little bit here lately. One thing I'm going to say first, though, I'm just like you all. I get to go out and I get to go fishing. Maybe I've been done a little bit longer than some of you. Some of you I probably haven't done as long as y'all have. I've probably been fishing the jig for 25 plus years, at least successful anyway. Probably a little bit longer than that, but at least the last 25 years. I've gone through a lot of different rods over the years based on a lot of situations, a lot of different determining factors. First of all, when we're talking about a jig, this is what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about just this right here is a Dirty Jigs 3/8 ounce Matt Herron flipping jig. Okay, so it's got a little bit heavier gauge hook. Not a super heavy brush guard, but a pretty good heavy brush guard. It's got almost like a archy style head with that flat eye on the front of it. I don't remember what bend it is, but it's about a 5/0, little shorter shank hook than normal. This isn't a finesse jig. This is a little more compact than a lot of the jigs that you're going to see out there. But this is the type of jig that I'm going to consider my favorite as far as overall jig. Now, a lot of you that watch the videos that I make, I love throwing a finesse jig, especially in the wintertime. It's got a little bit lighter hook. Usually the ones I make's got a little 4/0 hook, a little bit thinner diameter. I don't know the exact size, but a little bit thinner diameter than this hook. That takes a little bit softer rod. Yes, you can throw it on this rod. You just have to be on your hook set. You have to be mindful of which jig you have. These heavier style jigs here have always been my favorite. The problem has been as I've gotten older, I've had to change my hook set a little bit. I'm not as quick as I used to be as far as setting the hook. I've had to kind of be a little more mindful, but I think in some instances it's probably made me just a little bit better. At the beginning there, I showed you a couple clips and a couple fish that I've caught on a jig, not to brag about myself, but just so you can see that I have been very successful over the years with a jig. So the rod that I'm going to talk about today, now that we've talked a little bit about the jig, because they actually go hand in hand. That's very important. That's what a lot of people don't realize. A lot of the videos that you're going to watch, what they're going to tell you is they're going to tell you that, oh, well, if you want to be a good flipper with a jig, then what you need is a 7/6 rod, 7/11, needs to be a heavy action, needs to have, 25-pound test or braid, and needs to do all these. They're going to tell you all these things, or they're going to tell you the generic answer that just get you a 7-foot medium heavy and that's going to work good for you. Well, yes and no. The combo that I'm getting ready to show you and tell you is not simply by accident. This is years of me trying different techniques and trying different things. Okay, so the rod that we're going to talk about, not a brand new rod. This right here was a rod that I came across at a bait shop that they had at a decent price because it was used. You can pay a little bit of money and get a no questions asked depending on the style or design that you have. This one here had a guide or two on it that was kind of rough, and all I did was just epoxy it back in place. But this is a G Loomis GL3 844C 7-foot heavy. Now, this is an older rod, okay? The reason I'm telling you that is because the newer IMX Pros, I have nothing against them. They are a wonderful rod. I used to have 2 of them. I used to use them for spinnerbait and for jigs. I had 2 different setups that were pretty much twins, okay? Wonderful rods for that 1/2 ounce spinnerbait that I make. Wonderful rod for heavier action jig or finesse jig. It'll actually do a little bit of both. compromised in any way. This rod right here, though, this GL3, this is the older action of the G Loomis. Okay, this is back before Shimano and G Loomis were basically, Shimano bought out G Loomis. Okay, this is before that. This is the old style blank. This rod right here, it's interesting because as far as the strength and backbone, as soon as you feel it, you're like, my goodness, it's a broomstick. But it's really interesting the action that this has on the front. I can't really just bend it and show you because it's not going to give you a good example. What you'll have to do is you either have to find one, or you'll have to watch some of my videos where you see me using this specific rod so you can see the bend. You can see the reaction time on this rod, which is something that I've learned and I'll talk about here in just a minute, makes up for the fact of my shoulders the way they are. It's something I didn't expect. This is just as light as my MX Pro, especially with this my titanium reel. This rod right here, not only is this going to be a review, but this is going to be just a few minutes of me telling you little things that I look for when I'm fishing a jig. I'm not looking for a 7.6, 7.11 rod anymore. When I'm going down the bank flipping, I use 20-pound fluorocarbon, just Seagull red level. That's what I use on this little combo. This does everything I want to do. I can throw a 3/8, I can throw a half, I can throw a quarter on this setup as long as it has that heavier gauge. And like I said, I can use that lighter wire hook if I want to, but I am going to take a chance with this setup, even with my shoulder the way that it is, and my slower hook set that I have anymore. I'm going to take a chance on that one good fish. On a smaller fish, probably isn't going to make a much difference, but on a heavier fish, anything 3 or 4 pounds, it's probably going to put some pressure, may even bend that hook. Not all the way out, but you may get only one fish out of it. I don't ever recommend setting the hook on a fish on a jig and then bending the hook back in place. Anytime you do that, that hook's weakened. You might as well take that jig off if that jig's going to bend its hook that way, but that's another talk about jigs. But this rod right here, what I didn't expect is not only is it lighter in the hand, especially with this titanium reel, but what it also has is the action on it. Like I was telling you, it does have a bend on the tip, but it takes a little bit of pressure of a good sized fish. So a decent sized bass, 1.5 to 2 pounds, it'll bend the rod a little bit, and then it's going to give you time to react to it. What I really wanted it for is a lot of these places I'm going to either have good sized fish, or I'm throwing it underneath trees, skipping it in these bushes way back under. I don't really have a lot of vegetation that I'm fishing them through. There is going to be a lake I go through in the wintertime that it does have, but by then the vegetation is really not there. So I'm not trying to like punch grass or nothing like that with it. This combo, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to, and I didn't even realize it was going to do that. I just could not pass up the price that I gave for this because of the quality of the other rod that it is. I couldn't pass it up. And when I got it in my hand, I realized, oh my goodness, I wished I'd have known this and realized the action that this has, how much more it helped my shoulder. Because what it did is the strength that this rod has in it, from literally 6 inches of the rod tip down, the strength that it has, the solid hook set that it gives, I don't have to exert as much from my arm or my shoulder in order to set the hook, and I don't have to do a whole lot to keep that fish pinned in. I caught a pretty nice fish on this at the evening one night when I was fishing a jig same way. I plan on using it a lot more, especially in that close contact type fishing, like you're going down the bank and just flipping. This is something that I had kind of quit doing for a while because, and that's why you see me lean more to crankbaits than anything and to that Ned rig, because I really couldn't find a combo that, something that I didn't think about, that maybe it'll be give tips to you all, maybe it'll help you think about it. If you're using a medium heavy rod, okay, and that has that softer tip that a lot of times what we tend to think as far as jig fishing is, oh, well, I need that softer tip, and I did the same thing. I need that soft tip to make up for the fact that I want him to get it for a minute and then set the hook. Well, the only problem with that, and something that I had never considered until I get this rod, is that fit, I was actually having to use more energy to set that hook because my rod was bending in order for me to drive that hook. Now, with my finesse jig, not as much. But whenever I started fishing a heavier gauge jig, and this wasn't the first jig that it started happening to me. That's not when I noticed it. When I noticed it was another jig that you see me using a lot, which is that Strike King swim jig. It's a heavy cover swim jig. It has a bigger diameter hook on it as well. So when I'm reeling it like a spinner bait and a fish hits me and I'm pulling back on that medium heavy, it was like sometimes I was getting them to the boat and they were falling off basically at the boat. And I'm like, I wonder what the deal is. It's it's got enough backbone. It's a medium heavy. It's a little bit lighter. I'm able to cast it longer throughout the day, which I was. But the problem that I was having was, and this is something I realized when I got this rod, I wasn't getting a solid hook set. And I hadn't really considered that. I just kind of always just was leaning to the lighter to give my shoulder because I'm using it. So by getting this combo here, once again, this is a G Loomis GL3. This is an MBR 844C 7-foot heavy. By getting this rod, not only was it's still sensitive enough that I was feeling the fish, but I use the jig in my hand a little bit looser than most people do. I'm not trying to grab my rod like this. As soon as one hits, I'm just jacking them. It's not what I'm doing. What I'm doing is I'm lightly holding that in my hand as I'm working that to me, and I usually have it in my left hand, and I'm kind of moving it around, but I keep it loose in my hand. And then when that fish does hit, that's when I kind of tighten just a little bit, and then I'm pulling back and I'm setting the hook. When I did that, I started to get a more solid hook set. Another little tip I'm going to give you about a jig when you throw it into that lock cover. A lot of times what we tend to do, and you see a lot of people talk about this, first thing they're going to do, and I get asked this a few times, well, when you get a jig, what do? Do you trim that and kind of even it with the hook? And I'm like, no, I plan on fishing it in heavy cover. And everybody usually gives me a look like, do what? I'm like, yeah, I plan on fishing in heavy cover. Why would I cut that weed guard down? Well, because it gives it a profile. I was like, that's what everybody talks about, and I don't understand it. I don't care what the jig looks like profile-wise. You think when that goes in the water and that's sinking through that tree, you think that bass comes out and he says, oh, well, I don't like the profile of that jig. You think that's what he thinks? He don't care. The reason I leave that weed guard on there the way it is because I want it to do its job. When I throw this right here into the cover and a bass doesn't hit it, I want to get the jig back so that I can go back and pitch it in another one. And then if a bass grabs it, he's going to grab the whole thing. And then guess what? When he has that in his mouth and I take this right here and I set the hook and I go to pulling him out, then I don't have to worry about it hanging up because it's in his face, it's in his jaw. So I'm going to get it out when I get him out. But a lot of times that's why people get frustrated, I feel like, with the jig, is because by the time they take this right here and they've trimmed this level with that and they throw it into a bush and they put just the slightest little pressure or they think you have a bite and they pull on it and that hook gets stuck on that tree, sometimes you can't go after it. What if you've got that 10, 15 feet down? Sometimes there goes, you lost your jig. A lot of people get frustrated because of that, okay? But what you've got to understand a lot of times too is that this hook right here, okay, if you have a heavier gauge wire hook, like I was saying, those swim bait hooks or swim jig hooks, that's the ones that made me realize this. A lot of the bigger fish that I was getting when I started going to a little bit heavier line because I was throwing it in the bushes. The finesse jig, don't get me wrong, awesome bait. Throw it in the winter, throw it in open cover, throw it all day long. I've caught a lot of big fish on that thing. I can't tell you how many big largemouth, smallmouth, spotted bass I've caught on that finesse jig. But every jig has a purpose. That swim jig, I can throw it just like a spinner bait into the deepest cover, And then when one hits me, I can pull it out. And if you've watched some of the videos I made, I've caught some monsters on that swim jig. But this right here, swim jig tends to have a lighter weed guard. So therefore, you are going to get hung up somewhat more. But a swim jig, you really don't let it. I fish it probably a little different than most people, because I'll still flip it just like a regular jig a lot of times. But I know that weed guard is softer, so I just slowly bring it out and bounce it through that. This jig right here, I don't really have to worry about it. I can pitch this back in there, and I'm pretty confident that I can bring it back out. This is the same jig that I pretty much took to Cumberland, and I fished it around all that rock and all those trees and everything all day. I caught pretty nice little smallmouth. I caught a couple spots on it already, and that was just one of the first days that I ever took it out and used it. So I was pretty impressed with it. But it reminded me of years ago when I used to just take a jig like this and just throw it in the trees, throw it in the cover. And that's what I fished with most of the day because of that. A lot of times I think that we do that with a lot of combos. You know, we tend to get a combo that we want to be good for everything. And something that I've had to get used to here in the last couple of years is that maybe sometimes that's not something we need to do. If your budget is low, I get it. But you really need to kind of determine what type of fishing you want to do. What technique. If you're still learning the techniques, then I would say yes, get your 3 medium action spinning rods or 2 medium action spinning rods, whatever you can afford. Get your 2 medium heavy or 1 medium heavy rod and 1 medium action rod for crankbaits, and just go and just try and just fish them and enjoy the day. If you want to try to make things a little bit easier on yourself and get a little more technique specific, then this heavy action rod is really what you need for this jig. Do you have to have a 7.6? No, you don't. Something that I believe is younger generation, they've watched so many of our videos, people's videos talking about a 7.11, 7.6. And I find it very interesting that after everybody gets in their 30s, it seems like you see a lot of people online selling their 7.5, 7.6 flipping rods that are heavy action. And why do you think that is? My guess is because it's heavy. They're looking for something a little more comfortable. To me, this 7 foot right here does everything I need it to do. So far, I've caught plenty of fish on it. Every little trip I've been on, it's done good to me. But that's kind of the review that I wanted to give on it, because a lot of times, and I've tried to give an honest review on every rod that I've ever used. I mentioned to you that I was going to tell you about this reel a little bit. The gear ratio that I use on this is a 6.2. And that goes back to the same thing. A lot of people, what you hear them say, as soon as they start talking about a jig and they talk about pitching any type of plastic, they want to go 7 to 8 gear higher. Okay. The reason they do that is because they say when they flip it in there, that way they can reel it up and bring it back to them fast. I understand that point, but I'm going to give you a suggestion. Try it one day with a 6 to 2. If you're in the wintertime, try it with a 5. You say, well, why in the world would I want to do that? Because when I'm throwing a swim jig, I use 6 to 2. That's my favorite speed. I'll throw it out, reel it back just like a spinnerbait. It's kind of medium. Sometimes I'll pump it. Sometimes I'll shake it in place. And if I'm throwing a regular casting jig or even a football jig, I like this 6 to 2. The reason I do that is because 9 times out of 10, when I'm throwing a jig or I'm throwing a swim bait, I'm not trying to burn it. I'm not trying to bring it down through there smoking where it comes back to me. If I'm going to burn something, I'm going to burn something like a rattle trap. I'm going to burn something like maybe a buzz bait over top of them. I'm going to use a top water or a jerk bait where I'm moving that bait back continuously, working depending on what time it is. Even a crankbait, I'll use a 6-2. In the winter, I'll go back to a 5.6 because I really wanted to slow down and work methodically, whatever I'm doing. So when I go to, whether it be a drop shot, whether it be a little Ned rig, or I go to a jig, the reason I'm going to that is because they're cover specific and I'm wanting to slow down. If the bite were active, then I'd be throwing a crankbait, a moving bait, constantly moving. If I'm gonna throw a jig, I'm slowing down. That's the whole purpose. So a lot of times, we don't really pay attention to what the fish are doing. A lot of times we go out and we buy a brand new combo and we pitch out there and we shake it once or twice, we reel in, we go the next one. We throw out, we reel in, we go the next one. And then we're like, man, I don't understand it. Man, I'd sure like to catch a fish on that setup, you know, I just bought it the other day. And it's like, well, if you see that tree right there, look at the pocket you're in. How many trees are in that pocket? He said, well, there's only 3 of them. How long did you spend on those trees? You say, well, I don't know, I made a couple casts in there and I left. The difference a lot of times is the guy that goes in there that catches the fish, he probably made 10 to 15 casts on those same trees. He literally went and pitched to the edge of it, closest to the boat. Then he pitched a little bit closer in. Then he pitched to the right side. Then he pitched a little closer in. Then he took that thing and he threw it way back in there. He let it fall straight. He let it sit there. Counted to 2, shook it, let it sit there. Counted to 2, bounced it up. It hit one little tree limb. All of a sudden the line took off. He set the hook and caught a 3-pounder out of it. You're like, what? How is that even possible? I'm telling you. That's one of the reasons why I've gone over the last 20 years to these 6-2 gears. I had some 7s. I used them for a little bit. You see me use them in the videos. I switched back and I went back to 6-2. Why? Because too many times I was fishing way too fast. Even when I'm fishing a crankbait, I slow down with that crankbait. I may make 20 casts if I'm throwing a crankbait to that brush pile. But if I'm throwing a jig, and that's one of the reasons why I started going back. And after I had this set up, I made sure I went back and I got another rod that's similar, but with a similar action to it. And I was extremely impressed when I realized, man, I completely overlooked the fact that that heavier rod actually makes up the difference and draws that fish out. Is it sometimes an overkill for a 1-pound bass? Yes, it is. The 20-pound test, okay, a lot of times somebody sees that and they're like, well, why do you fish 20? Sometimes, most of the time we're going to catch 2-pound bass. You're absolutely right. But I tell you what, when a 4-pounder gets me in that tree and I'm getting ready to pull him out, this rod right here, I can pull him out of there. He may be still a fight, but I'm more confident that I can get him back out. Okay, if I go into that brush pile with a medium heavy rod and 15-pound line, it has nothing to do with me thinking he's going to break me off. That's not what I'm worried about. What I'm worried about is him pulling me against those trees and sawing me, and him breaking off while he's in there. Am I so worried that I'm not going to get the fish? Well, of course I'd love to catch the fish, but I also really don't want that jig stuck in his mouth. I'd like to at least get to look at him, take a picture with him, put him back in the water. You know, so that's the reason why this combo right here has kind of took me back several years and made me realize that, man, I'd overlooked something so simple. And hopefully it's something that'll be a little bit of help to you all. I will give you one other little tip. Another thing that this 20-pound line does is it slows down that fall of that bait just a little bit. A lot of times you use that 15 to get you down the bottom, keep you on the bottom. This 20, even though sometimes it may seem like it's an overkill, it actually, if you put it on a 3/8 or 1/4 ounce jig, it'll actually slow the fall down a little bit. So will it be the trailer that you use. Just because I'm using a 3/8 doesn't mean that I'm wanting that thing to go straight to the bottom. Depending on the trailer that I have will depend on how fast that moves down too. So just an added little tip there. Anyway, that's the talk about though, that's a little review on that rod. It's very lightweight, very solid rod. I mean, if you're wanting something to fish a little finesse jig, this is not the rod you want. Okay, but if you're looking to fish a 3/8 heavy cover jig and you wanting to throw it into bushes and you want to get that fish back out, then this is the rod you need to use. That's a G Loomis GL3 844C 7-foot heavy. Old school rod, but I'm telling you, it works. Anyway, God bless you all. Hope this helps you. Hope this gives you little tips. Hope the little talk about the jig fishing didn't bore you. Hope it helped you a little bit. Hope the pictures and stuff, you can see that, look, it has nothing to do with how much better I have. I've just been blessed to have decent equipment. I've been blessed with opportunities to catch some nice fish. I thank the good Lord for it. Hope these little tips help you all catch more fish. Don't forget, Jesus loves you. In the world we're in right now, a lot of people are wondering and thinking and have a very low self-esteem a lot of times. You need to realize that you're never going to be complete until you accept the Lord Jesus Christ as your Savior. You're never really going to feel complete in your life until you admit that you need help. And there's only one man that can help you, and his name's Jesus. You all have a wonderful day. Thank you all for subscribing. Thank you all for sharing the videos. Thank you all for, you're just a big blessing to me. Y'all have a wonderful day.